So I'm Scott Burden. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I work as the interim director of the Pride Center at Lehigh University, so I'm connecting to Lehigh. I identify as a cisgender male, and I identify my sexuality, in some ways my gender a little bit, as queer.
How specifically did you discover and get involved in the prison abolition movement?
So initially, my sort of entry point into prison abolition was during my graduate school years. So I studied in a higher ed program from like 2014 to 2016. And I remember reading a book, and it was called Normal Life by Dean Spade, that specifically introduced me to this concept of administrative violence, or what otherwise might be known as like systemic violence or systemic racism, but Dean Spade named it as administrative violence, particularly because he's a legal scholar and looks at the ways that legal system informs people's lived experiences. And so in that text, I specifically was introduced to a section around like incarcerated trans folks in particular, and the violence that they encounter in gendered prison facilities. And so that was like super eye-opening to me, and specifically my interest lied in how systems further sort of perpetuate harmful gender binaries. So how do we think about how is gender created and recreated, in particular the gender binary, by administrative systems? So the police, the prison system is one of those systems that needs the reproduction of harmful gender ideologies maintained in order to function how they're designed to function. And so that was sort of like the philosophical moment of like, oh my God, like these systems are like perpetuating harmful gender ideologies. And then from there, like I went towards like looking at things like sex work and how sex work was criminalized, which led to, more incarceration of queer folks, in particular queer, Black and brown individuals. So all of like those connections started to be made. And then when I got to Lehigh, we began in the Pride Center doing the intentional focuses. And we first started with racial justice and decolonization. And through that sort of experience, read more around Angela Davis, like Our Prison's Obsolete, and just begun to do more work in particular in the idea of prison. I should say criminal justice more broadly, especially as we thought about racial justice. But throughout all of that time was really confronted with that idea of reform versus abolition, worked through my understanding of the various positions as it pertains to reform and abolition, and ultimately just arrived at the place of recognizing that I believe these systems are created to further perpetuate harm and reinforce gender ideologies that are incredibly harmful. Through that experience, and then last year, we decided to take a deep dive into prison abolition as our intentional focus in the Pride Center, and have continued that ever since.
What connection do you see between like the queer community and prison abolition? And then specifically, like, how do you see that play out like at Lehigh among the queer folks that you interact with?
So I think first and foremost, there is a connection between gender justice and racial justice, right? Or queer justice and racial justice. So like, I'm a firm believer that queer justice has to center racial justice, and if it doesn't, we're doing the work wrong. So out of that sort of understanding, we zoomed out even more, and we're like, okay, what systems within the US, or in a particular US Western-based context, what particular systems are contributing to the forms of racist and racial violence that queer and trans people of color face in our world, right? In particular, again, in a US context, which led us to think about criminal justice. And from there, we began to do some work with, like I mentioned, Angela Davis, and with other Black feminists in particular who have criminal justice, racial justice, and even prison abolition at the center of their work. So taking all of that, specifically, we looked at how prisons reproduce the gender binary, and how prisons and the criminal justice system in general are meant to control, right? In particular, are designed to control and maintain white supremacy. So if we know all of that philosophically, theoretically, the only way then to push forward this work, and this is our opinion in the Pride Center, is to center it in all that we do, and as we connect it to things like criminal justice and again, that reproduction of the gender binary. And so I'd say kind of like all over the place, but I think like the main connection truly for us is that in our work, who is disproportionately harmed most based on our world? And that is unequivocally Black trans women face higher rates of violence, higher rates of criminalization, higher rates of domestic violence. I mean, just the list is long, right? And so if we can imagine a world that responds to people differently or that treats harm caused by individuals differently, then we can imagine a world that's free of the gender binary. And that doesn't mean that we're imagining a world that's free of gender necessarily, but we're imagining a world that's free of the restrictions of the binary. And so for us, that comes and is directly connected to prison abolition. Because as you know, prison abolition is not just about getting rid of a building, it's about unlearning the internalized notions of how we hold one another accountable and how we understand harm and who does and does not cause harm.